After e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, white continues with bishop e5, the Rossolimo. After queen to b6, this is the move we're going to go through in this video, white continues with bishop a4. This seems a little unusual compared to the previous videos and the previous scenarios. The reason is that the black player does not have the option of a6, b5 because the b pawn is blocked by the queen. So we can afford to keep this pin. And black to play now. There's a bunch of moves that are possible. In this video, I'm going to go through the most popular, which is g6. But in the other videos, I'm going to go through the other move that is also popular, e6, and d6, which is not ideal, but it is also quite popular. After g6, white continues with c3. The idea is to reinforce the control of the center in d4 by putting as many pawns as possible to control the dark squares, and bishop g5, bishop g7, which is the only diagonal where it's possible to develop the dark square bishop, will not be as effective. Let's take into account very quickly that this classical Sicilian with Rossolimo variation with black playing queen to b6 is incredibly popular, but it's not supposed to be the best. This move here is blocking the development of this pawn, allowing the pawn in b7, allowing the development of the bishop through the ideal fianchetto. I slightly prefer queen c7 to queen b6, although queen c7 is also not ideal. After g6 at d3, c3, black cannot continue with bishop to g7 or knight f6. Let's look at both ideas. Bishop to g7 immediately, and white will castle. White is already better here. The black player, by playing this setup with g6, has to be careful to the development of this knight in f6 because it will come with the win of a lot of tempos by the white player. Let's start with this move, e5 now, which will be able to allow the knight to develop from f6 naturally and then castle. We will also look at other options. After e5, so now white continues with d4. After pawn takes d4, c takes, and then c takes back, the idea, if white were to play again, would be to take the pawn here, and that would be completely winning. If knight were to take the pawn, then knight e5 will come, forcing the bishop to take, and then we could go on with knight to a3. Bishop b2 cannot happen here, even though there's two attackers, because the knight in c4 will be attacking queen and bishop, and so after knight a3 and the bishop retreating to g7, also because of the threat of knight c4 anyway, white continues with knight to b5, and now there's idea of reaching d6, which would be deadly. So now the best move will be bishop e5 again, but white continues with bishop e3, winning another tempo and developing a piece. So this is just a scenario. Of course, we don't get to play again, but this is just a scenario of how to exploit a specific setup. So back in this situation, this is what we're threatening. Black has to play very accurately. Of course, the pawn in d cannot move because, to allow the development of the light square bishop, because d5 is attacking the knight and will win the piece. So the black bishop, the light square bishop, as mentioned before, can't move on the fianchetto, of course, and knight f6 will run into e5, which is really stupid. So best move by black is to take the pawn in d4, also because it's fairly supported. Now white continues with knight a3, and after the natural knight g2 e7, white continues with bishop f4. After castling, it looks like everything's fine, but white has domination over the board, and with the move bishop to d6, this bishop in c8 will never play, and the rook in a8 will also struggle a lot to go out and play. Could this have been stopped? Let's go back a move. So instead of castling after bishop f4, well, what can black do? Let's mention that white has a threat of going to c4 with an attack on the queen, and then d6. The attack on the queen, the black player will have to move, and even if the queen goes back to well, c7 is not possible because of the bishop. Either other square, let's say queen to c5 or any other square, actually, knight d6 remains a threat because the knight is protected from the bishop. So right now it's black to move, and we just said we need the castle. Well, what else can black do? d6 still runs into knight to b5, and so this bishop here is destined to remain there locked. If black plays d5, to stop the knight from reaching the square c4 and allow this bishop to develop. And maybe the black player will think of developing pieces eventually. Maybe we'll have some hope. This would be met by knight b5, and we have just these incredible threats. And if black castles now, we have bishop to c7 attacking the queen, and the queen can't really go anywhere except two squares, a6 and c5. Well, the square c5 is attackable by the rook in c1, and the queen will eventually get trapped. So after rook c1, only square to go for the queen is b4, and after a3, only square is to take b2, and then rook c2 will do. So in this position, after d5, knight b5, as we said, castling will lead to bishop c7, and then the other square would be queen to a6, but then knight d6. White here has a great advantage, and the threat of playing bishop b5 to trap the queen. Black will have to go and get a massive headache to get out of this situation alive. In fact, it is impossible for this queen to escape being trapped by the move bishop b5. The best move by black, found by the engine, really hard to find, is simply to counterattack and go for some attempt of equalizing material eventually, although black will be in a disadvantage. Pawn takes e4 is the best move with an attack on the knight, and then bishop b5 comes, and white has a good advantage after all the swaps. So let's make a recap. Bishop b5 and then queen b6, bishop goes to a4. In this video we're going through g6, c3, bishop to g7, castle. And after e5, d4, pawn takes, and then pawn takes. Due to the pressure in e5 and all the pattern that we've saw before. Now knight a3. So after the natural knight g2, e7 and bishop f4, black castles, we mentioned earlier that we're going to d6 with the bishop and paralyze the situation. The idea now is to play a move like knight to b5, achieving absolute domination of the board. We go knight c6, knight c7 ideas. The rook will then be forced on the same diagonal as this bishop. After a6, for example, white continues with the best move, bishop to b3, applying pressure on this pawn, and it's crucial to understand the simplicity and greatness of this move. We're putting pressure on the pawn that is not supported by any other pawn, of course, but also because the e pawn is gone from the e file. It's on the d file now, and what happens is there is no usual pawn in e6 or like a potential pawn in e6 that would make this bishop weaker, and that reduces the possibility of the development of this rook in f8, because once the rook is gone, this pawn will be only protected by the king, and white will be able to apply pressure, knight g5, queen f3 ideas, to apply pressure on such pawn. So bishop b3, best place to place our bishop. White has now ideas of setup like rook to e1, rook to c1, moves like h4, knight to g5, and so on. So those will be the moves if we were to play again. So look at black's situation. He can't develop this bishop, he can't develop the rook in a8, and black's best move according to the engine is queen to d8, and it's easy to understand why. The idea is obviously to push b5 and develop the development of the bishop through fianchetto and rook to c8, which will give black an absolutely fine game if black were to play many moves in a row. So after queen to d8, white continues with knight to c2. We have now three attackers over the square d4, and this cannot be stopped. There's no way to put another defender to such a square, unless the queen wants to go to b6, but that means that the last two moves have been going back and forth, and white will just go on with his natural development, h4, knight g5, rook e1, and so on. And then the black player is just cancelling his own plan of being able to develop this bishop. So after b5, black is finally willing to develop. So knight in c, the most backward knight takes the pawn in d4, and after bishop to b7, it looks like the black player will be able to play a normal game. Let's remember the rook b8 was never an option. Now white takes the knight in c6. The knight cannot capture back because the knight is pinned. And right now we're going to go through the move bishop takes knight. Also because pawn takes back comes with knight to g5. White has a great advantage. This now cannot be stopped. For example, that here there's a sacrifice that can be done. And let's say, for example, pawn to h6 attacking the knight. This is met by bishop takes f7, and then after rook takes and knight takes and king takes, queen to b3 check. And now the king has two options that are worth seeing, e8 and f8. After queen to e8, white continues with rook to d1, putting the rook on the same file of the opponent queen. And the idea of the white player now is to play queen to g3 and then bishop to e5 with an attack on the queen by the rook and attack on the bishop. Black will have to play like an engine to survive this. Black's best move according to the engine is c5 to give more space to the bishop, maybe allow development of the rook. And by the way, let's mention that the knight couldn't have gone to c8, for example, to start attacking the bishop or put more pressure, because we're just having this incredible diagonal. So after c5, bishop takes, best move. And black's best is queen to c7. Now the black player can finally try to finish development. White continues with rook 8 to c1. And a threat of playing bishop to d6, winning the game. This is terribly hard for black to defend and incredibly pleasant for white to play. So back in the same position as before, after bishop and knight sacrificing f7 and king and rook take, queen b3 check. What happens if the king goes back to f8? We don't have the same motive of going to g8, of having the possibility to go to g8, but the knight is pinned. White continues with rook 8 to d1. The idea is to play rook d3, very simple, and then rook to f3. Now you know the idea. What's the best thing to do for the black player to stop that from happening? c5 again, to allow an idea of bishop takes e4, keeping an eye on the square f3. However, this is met by queen to e6 with the threat of bishop e5, a discover attack basically. And also the idea of swapping with the bishop when the queen moves and infiltrating the rook in the 7th rank. White's completely winning. So back at this position, after knight takes, we mentioned the knight cannot take. We mentioned the reason why the pawn cannot take. So after bishop takes, white continues with queen d2. The idea very simple, to be supported by the rook in d1, put more pressure on the isolated pawn, and potentially play knight to e5 to dismiss this bishop and have full control over the file, especially exploiting this pin. And in case the black player were to take the bishop, then black should never get rid of this bishop, especially for a knight. White also has the idea of playing knight to g5. So black's best move now is h6 to stop knight g5 from happening. Also because the black player will need to develop this rook in f8 at some point, so will have to go to e8, but this will leave a very weak f7 pawn. So if black doesn't play h6 and the rook moves, then it's easy to get these two pieces going into attack on f7. So after h6, white plays knight to e5, as mentioned before. So we still have an attack on that square, on f7, and also on the bishop.